Okay, good morning. This is where I was yesterday on a cold day across the bay from the Indian Head Naval Support Facility. I don't really know what it does. It's over there. And just show you a few pictures of what I've been doing recently. First Baptist Church last Sunday, Advent. And there's a memorial on I Street and 17th Street for the National Guardsmen, the persons that were shot. Very tragic event. There's a little video. There's actually a sheriff's boat there. It says a sheriff, and that's the same picture. There's the sheriff's boat again, and some other scenes around Indian Head, the entrance to the naval facilities over there. That I went to the MGM Hotel at National Harbor. That's a library, kind of fitting for me. Books. We're going to talk about books. Some sculptures in the MGM Hotel. Looks like two planets, doesn't it? The Christmas tree. And that's the other one I took. So today I want to talk particularly about the fourth book that's coming up. And let's get right into it. Um, the title of it would be Do Ask, Do Tell, A Lone Wolf Faces His Own Wounds from Erratic Liberalism, which force him into join or die situations. That's kind of the proposed title. And um, to drive, it should be contents. There would be 8 chapters. Um, First of all, an introduction, and then some a summary of all my online and book publishing to now. Um, some discussion of my strategy, giving away a lot of stuff for free rather than being a salesman. That comes into play. Um, then chapter 2 is sort of about the spiritual aspects. I talk a little bit about my own idea of past lives and reincarnation and whether I'm really alone or not. Um, then the third chapter will recap a subject I had taken up many years ago, our fundamental rights in that little booklet. I'm going to recap that and then talk about the Yogyakarta principles, which leads to the discussion of unpacking gender ideology, which I did not cover in the third book. That's the biggest chapter. Then the other big topic that is of great concern to me is online verification for essentially all online access, whether websites or apps on your phones, and whether social media or eventually maybe even everything, not even just social media. We've all heard about the situation in Australia recently. And then something about elections. On election, I've worked on elections several times since 2000. The 16-hour days, they get to be a way of life. You think you're always in them when you're on duty. And whether there were other vulnerabilities that we haven't talked about in the elections, there might be. And then something about immigration, whether the Trump administration really is breaking the law all the time, or probably isn't, but maybe in a few cases. And then this whole problem of accelerationism, what's going to happen to our civilization. And then I'm also planning to add movie treatments. I had, I had made a list the last time on October the 9th when I was talking about the proposed book. And the outline of the biographical outline of my life that I showed on October 9th, that would just be online. It wouldn't be part of the book because it's too big. But the proposed movie treatments, I whittled them down a little bit to the short film and expulsion about my William and Mary expulsion. And then a chapter about graduate school, my being an assistant instructor and then sending people to the draft and then getting drafted myself. That's two. And then the short story in the third book, Expedition, I'm broadening that story out to have more in it. And then something that happened when I was substitute teaching and when my online content back in 2005 caused a problem, all that personal stuff. And then the short that I was doing in the practical screenwriting group that a little bit erotic, but illustrates another interesting point. It's called Lineage. It's one I'm proposing. Rather than, there was a story called The Ocelot the Way He Is in the third book. This is actually shorter and more suitable to be put in a book, I think. And I want to go through, first of all, of the websites. There's been a website for the third book for several years. So that Do Ask, Do Tell book 3. But of course, more recently, there's this one that I showed you the last time. The Do Ask, Do Tell series as it is right now. And presents all three of the books as they are now. We would add the fourth book to it. And you can see that the site plays as you leave it there. And then let me just go through. I kind of want to go through a couple of points here. Let me just run through quickly what the previous books were. In 1997, I had a print run, about 400 copies of my first book, before I moved to Minnesota for 6 years. Do Ask, Do Tell, Gay Conservative Lashes Back. And it went to POD in 2000 after I sold out the first set of copies. And that the main concern was the parallelism between the forced intimacy problem in military life in the barracks, and then the forced intimacy problem that I experienced in college dormitories back in 1961. I made that argument to that the idea that even service members at the time sort of could have a double life, particularly when they were stateside, to respect their privacy and fundamental rights in order to lift the ban. And we all know that the book was published in 1997, POD in 2000. We all know that Don't Ask, Don't Tell was repealed finally in 2011. That's the transgender ban is something different. So that's all going to be discussed in the book. Then at the end of 1998, I did this little booklet that I did, Our Fundamental Rights, that I ran out of copies. So I'm going to cover that in chapter 3 when I add to it the Yogyakarta principles discussion. But I'm going to talk about, which is, by the way, specifically about gay and gender identity issues largely. But I'm going to talk about go over the entire presentation I did and update it in this new book, because that book never went POD and it ran out of copies essentially. Then at the end of 2002, which was about a year after 9/11, I did a set of essays called When Liberty is Stressed. And we talked about terrorism. We talked about conscription, the draft, what would happen if the draft came back. which, by the way, was an issue for why Don't Ask, Don't Tell was a problem, because it affected security clearances. It could be an issue if we ever brought the draft back. And it could have, in some ways, it could affect some areas of civilian employment. And then I talked about the family values, even as they were in the 90s, about the tension between people who have children in normal families and people who remain lone wolves like me. There was a lot of economic tension going on. I talked about in the first, and I carried that on with some of the essays. I also talk about the polarities, the Paul Rosenfeld polarities, which were presented in chapter 3 in the first book when I talking about how I came out. But that, that in the 1970s, well, eventually, and then later on, we had Judith Butler and the idea of performativities, which are just sort of like a derivative in calculus of polarity, so to speak, sort of an elaboration, a rate of change kind of idea like calculus. And this has gotten blown up to becoming identity politics with, gender identity particularly since 2010, and more especially since the late 2010s, and then as we came out of the pandemic, becoming visible publicly. It wasn't real visible for a number of years. And I didn't cover that in the third book. I kind of went over all the material in the first two books and brought them up to date as how things were in 2013 when I was writing it. And I kind of said that if you are someone who doesn't go along with the model of being a normative man or woman and marrying and having children, you need to do other things for society, but you kind of need to, suck up a little bit to society's expectations of you and do something that participates more collectively in society. And I said all that in what I call the epilogue of the nonfiction section in this third book, with no mention at all of gender identity, and no recognition at all that concept was becoming important. And then at the time when I was writing it was barely being talked about, even though it was starting to circulate in academic circles. So I needed to keep this series complete. I needed to deal with that, which is one of the reasons there's going to be a big chapter on gender identity in the fourth book. And, the idea of the two biggest problems are the involvement of minors, both in the schools and possibly medically. That's an issue. And also the compromise of biological women's only spaces sometimes is an issue. And yet those of us in the traditional gay community were expected to join in supporting this. And that's become a problem for a lot of conscience for a lot of us. Also, I have a trust and organizations that support GLBT, as you understand it, are in the trust. So that's an issue for me, particularly because it forces me to deal with what I'm going to support. So it's a really big issue for me. And I also wanted to cover some of the other issues, particularly elections and immigration, the asylum seeker thing, which I was involved in a little bit in 2016, or almost got involved in, has changed. Needed to talk about that a little bit, and then just talk about where I think we're headed as a society. Are the rich people all going to go into their bunkers and leave us to rot or something? What's going to happen to us? I talk about that in the last chapter. Now, I also just need to talk about a couple other things. When you write a book and you publish it, you're expected to sell copies of books as consumer items and in stores, and not on Amazon and Barnes and Noble too, and online. And particularly on Kindle, that's okay. It's usually cheaper on Kindle, but you're expected to sell things, and that's a lot easier for material that's is naturally consumer oriented, like recipe books or cookbooks or some children's books or novels. I mean, you can certainly make a business of being a fiction author. I just never got down that path. I never quite got down the path of being a video personality with having a big YouTube channel um doing interviews of other people and that kind of thing, and having hundreds of thousands of subscribers and Patreon. Having inheritance might be a problem with that, and having a house, there could have been structural problems and selling, and so that it gets renovated and sold again to someone else as $1 million house or $2 million house after renovation, and then moving into downsizing and moving into a condo was kind of what I had to do. And so I kind of stayed in the vein of blogging. I talk a lot about how I was successful blogging for a long time in the book, into up until the time after the pandemic was over, essentially. And versus having a video channel, I talk about that a lot in this fourth book. And but the other thing to remember is I didn't pester people with promotions or sending a lot of email to you or messages to you or trying to do deals or something. I did not want to hucksterize my stuff. You know, the whole economy, particularly after 9/11, the whole economy started becoming kind of hucksterized. You were supposed to get a job you were supposed to become a life insurance agent or a tax preparer or um, sell subprime mortgages or something. And that kind of led to 2008. So, in a way, I'm glad I didn't, but I never really proved I could pay my dues in the workplace, maybe the way I should have. That's something I talk about in the fourth book too, the lone wolf chapter, the first chapter. Um, so um, the other thing is some of this is going to be online, particularly the autobiographical section, the trace that's quite detailed. I want to put that online. And the website I have now, the author website, and then the WordPress blog I have now. I may have to put some of this under age gates. Right now, you've heard what happened in Australia, and other countries are going to do it. They're talking about social media companies, but this could extend to internet access in general, because I do talk about a lot of adult things that maybe younger children shouldn't be exposed to. And I know what's going on in the schools with gender identity complicates that. And the fact that it was online all the time, even from people like me, and it was on the mainstream media, though, too, on corporate media, on cable and TV and so forth. It was being talked about in the media all the time, kind of forced the schools into presenting this material in lower grades, probably. We got, you know, we um, these the even when I finished the third book and 20 was available in early 2014, we hadn't gotten the decision on gay marriage yet. That wasn't until 2015. We had ended Don't Ask, Don't Tell, which was not done in the courts. That was done by Congress. Um, but we had not gotten the Supreme Court on gay marriage. We had gotten the sodomy law repeal in 2003 with Lawrence versus Texas. And then you saw the Supreme Court starting to walk back um, on Roe versus Wade, but they did not walk back on the Kim Davis thing on gay marriage recently. So that was somewhat reassuring. But there's a lot going on that's very disturbing. Transgender is still banned from the adult. Or Trump has doubled down on that, but there's no reason why adults who are stable, there are not that many of them, but some of them have skills that are very good, like in intelligence and so forth. There's no reason why adults are fully stable medically shouldn't be able to serve, in my opinion. Why it shouldn't be is the way it was. So we'll get into all of that in the books. And that's what I have today. Just to just take one last look at that table of contents again. And there it is. I don't know if I can expand it or not, make it look bigger or not on Google Drive. But I could also show you a copy of, I think the first one of the chapters. This doesn't seem to, well, here's what the introduction looks like. I'll show you that. We're not going to read it here, but I'll show it that to you. That's what I have today, and I do thank you for listening.